The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting dancing lights across the massive penthouse that stretched across the entire top floor of the building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights of Manhattan twinkled like fallen stars. Inside, the air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the gentle clink of champagne glasses. This wasn't just any party. This was the kind of event where million-dollar deals got made over cocktails, where politicians rubbed shoulders with celebrities, and where everyone wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. Richard Blackwell moved through his guests with the ease of a man who owned everything he touched. And he did own quite a bit. His real estate empire had made him one of the richest men in the city, with a fortune that most people couldn't even imagine. But money wasn't enough for Richard. He loved being the center of attention, loved being the man who threw the parties everyone talked about for months afterward. And he especially loved being the one who created those unforgettable moments that had his friends laughing and sharing stories for years. Tonight was his annual charity gala, though if anyone were being honest, the charity part was really just an excuse. Sure, some money would go to whatever cause his assistant had picked this year, but the real purpose was simpler. It was about showing off, about reminding everyone in his circle exactly who had the power, the money, and the influence, about entertaining himself. And Richard had something special planned for tonight. He'd been thinking about it for weeks, ever since the idea first popped into his head. Every year he tried to top himself, to create a moment that would become legendary among his friends. 2 years ago, he'd hired a fake fortune teller who told absurdly specific predictions about his guests that were actually just embarrassing secrets he'd dug up. Last year, he'd staged a fake FBI raid that had half his guests panicking before he revealed it was a prank. His friends called him a genius. Others called him cruel. Richard didn't much care which. He just cared that people were talking about him. This year's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He'd spotted his target earlier in the evening while the catering staff was setting up. She was young, probably late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore the standard black and white uniform of the catering company. But there was something about the way she carried herself that caught his attention. She kept her head down, never making eye contact with the guests. Her shoes were worn at the heels, clearly old and probably the nicest pair she owned. When she thought no one was looking, he'd seen her rubbing her temples like she had a headache she was trying to hide. Perfect, he'd thought. Absolutely perfect. The woman moved through the crowd now, carrying a tray of champagne flutes with practiced efficiency. She navigated around designer gowns and tailored suits, somehow managing to be invisible despite being right in the middle of everything. That was the thing about service workers at events like these, Richard had noticed. Rich people had a talent for looking right through them, as if they were part of the furniture rather than actual human beings. Her name was Diana Chen, though Richard didn't know that yet. He didn't care to know. To him, she was just the hired help, a prop for his evening's entertainment. Diana had taken this catering job 3 weeks ago, adding it to her already exhausting schedule. During the day, she waited tables at a diner in Queens, the kind of place where coffee was always hot and the regulars knew her by name. The morning shift started at 6, which meant getting up at 4:30 to catch the train. At night, she picked up these high-end catering gigs whenever she could get them. The money was better, even if the work meant standing for hours in uncomfortable shoes while wealthy people treated her like she was invisible. A single night like tonight could bring in what she made in 3 days at the diner. She needed every dollar. Her mother's care facility cost almost $4,000 a month, and that was the cheap one. The doctor's bills kept coming, endless and crushing. The debt from her father's funeral 2 years ago still wasn't paid off. The funeral home kept sending payment reminders, polite but firm, and Diana sent them what she could each month, watching the total barely budge. Some nights, Diana lay awake doing math in her head, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. If she picked up one more catering shift per week, that was an extra $300 a month. If she cut her grocery budget and lived on rice and beans, she could save another $50. The numbers never quite worked out the way she needed them to. So she picked up extra shifts, skipped meals to save money, and told herself that somehow eventually it would be okay. It had to be okay. What other choice did she have? Tonight's party was in a different world from the one she inhabited. She'd grown up in a small apartment in Queens where the radiator clanked and the neighbors were loud. These people lived in places like this penthouse where a single room was bigger than her entire childhood home. They wore jewelry that sparkled with real diamonds, not cubic zirconia. They talked about their vacation homes and their investment portfolios while she counted quarters to do laundry. Diana tried not to think about it too much. Comparison was poison, her mother used to say, back when she could still remember sayings like that. Back before the Alzheimer's had started stealing her away piece by piece, she moved toward the kitchen to refill her tray, grateful for a moment away from the crowd. The other servers were grabbing trays and rushing back out, but Diana allowed herself 10 seconds to close her eyes and take a deep breath. Her feet ached. Her head throbbed. She was tired in a way that went deeper than just physical exhaustion. But the night was only half over, and she had bills to pay. As she picked up a fresh tray of champagne, the catering manager, Frank, caught her arm. He was a nervous man in his 50s who'd been running high-end events for 20 years. Right now, his face was flushed and uncomfortable. "Diana," he said quietly, "Mr. Blackwell wants to see you." Her stomach dropped. Had she done something wrong? Spilled something? Offended one of the guests somehow? She ran through the evening in her mind but couldn't think of any mistakes. "It's nothing bad," Frank said quickly, though his expression suggested otherwise. He has a request. A special request." Diana followed him back into the main room, weaving through the guests. The party was in full swing now. Someone had told a joke that had a group of men in expensive suits roaring with laughter. A woman in a dress that probably cost more than Diana made in 6 months was taking selfies near the windows, posing against the city skyline. And there, in the center of it all, stood Richard Blackwell. He was tall, with silver hair that was styled to look casually perfect, wearing a suit that had definitely been custom-made. He was holding a champagne glass and talking to a small group. But when he saw Frank approaching with Diana, his face lit up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, perfect timing," Richard said loudly, loud enough that several nearby conversations stopped. Diana stood there, her empty tray in her hands, wondering what was happening and why her instincts were screaming at her that something was very wrong. She could feel eyes turning toward them, curious and assessing. The attention made her skin prickle with anxiety. Richard took a sip of his champagne, drawing out the moment, clearly enjoying himself. Around them, more and more guests were noticing that something was about to happen. Conversations were dying out. People were turning to look. Someone pulled out their phone, and Diana, standing there in her worn shoes and borrowed uniform, had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Richard's smile grew wider as more guests turned to watch. He loved this feeling, the electricity in the air when everyone was waiting to see what he'd do next. This was his stage, his moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the penthouse. The remaining conversations died out completely. Everyone was watching now. "I hope you've all been enjoying your evening." There was a polite murmur of agreement, some applause. Diana stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea what was coming, but every instinct told her to run. The problem was she couldn't. She needed this job. She needed the money. "As many of you know," Richard continued, clearly enjoying himself, "I like to provide unique entertainment at these little gatherings. Something unexpected, something memorable." He gestured broadly toward the far corner of the room, where a magnificent grand piano sat gleaming under the lights. Diana hadn't paid much attention to it earlier. It was just another piece of expensive furniture in a room full of things she could never afford. "That piano cost me $200,000, Richard said casually, as if that were pocket change. Some guests gasped appreciatively. "It's a Steinway Model D, the same kind used in concert halls around the world. Absolutely beautiful instrument." He paused for effect. "But here's the thing. I bought it 3 years ago, and honestly, I can't play a single note. Seems like a waste, doesn't it?" There was some laughter from the crowd. Diana's confusion deepened. What did any of this have to do with her? Richard turned to face her directly, and the smile on his face made her stomach turn. "So I thought, why not give someone else a chance to try? Someone who probably has never seen a piano like this, let alone played one. He gestured toward Diana with a flourish. "What do you say? Would you like to give it a try?" The room went completely silent. Diana felt like she'd been punched in the gut. He was asking her to play the piano in front of all these people. This wasn't a genuine offer. This was mockery dressed up as generosity. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in the undertone of his voice. He thought she'd make a fool of herself and his wealthy friends would all have a good laugh at the poor waitress who couldn't play. I don't think that's a good idea, Diana managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Nonsense, Richard said loudly, cutting her off. Come on, don't be shy. Everyone here wants to see what you can do. Right, everyone? There was scattered applause, some encouragement shouted from his closest friends who'd clearly figured out what he was doing. They were in on the joke. But Diana also noticed some guests who looked uncomfortable, who weren't clapping, who seemed to recognize the cruelty in what was happening. Not that it mattered. Nobody was going to stand up for her. Nobody was going to tell Richard Blackwell that he was being cruel. He was too rich, too powerful, too important. Frank, the catering manager, leaned close to Diana and whispered urgently, "Just do it, please. Mr. Blackwell is paying us double our usual rate for tonight, but only if everything goes smoothly. If you refuse, he'll complain and the company will lose the contract. Just sit at the piano for a minute, make an excuse about not knowing how to play, and it'll be over." Diana felt trapped. If she refused, she'd cost Frank and all the other servers their bonuses. The catering company might fire her for causing trouble with a client. But if she agreed, she'd have to sit there and be humiliated in front of 100 strangers who already looked down on people like her. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll try." Richard clapped his hands together, delighted. "Wonderful. Everyone, let's give her some encouragement." The applause that followed felt like a mockery. Diana set down her tray and walked toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could feel every eye in the room on her. Some people had their phones out, recording. They wanted to capture this moment, this entertainment. The poor waitress being put on the spot by the rich host. It would probably end up on social media. Another viral video of someone being humiliated for other people's amusement. As she crossed the room, fragments of whispered conversations reached her ears. Oh my God, this is going to be painful to watch. Richard really outdid himself this time. Should we be filming this? It feels kind of mean. It's just a joke, relax. Diana reached the piano and stood there for a moment staring at it. Up close, it was even more beautiful than she'd thought. The black surface was perfectly polished, gleaming under the lights. The keys looked pristine, probably barely used. This instrument was just a status symbol to him, an expensive decoration. Richard came up behind her and pulled out the bench with an exaggerated bow. "Your throne awaits," he said, and his friends laughed. Diana sat down slowly, her hands shaking. The piano bench was the perfect height, the position exactly right. She could reach the pedals easily. Everything about it felt professional, designed for serious musicians. And here she was, about to be the punchline of a cruel joke. She looked out at the crowd of faces watching her. Some were smirking, anticipating the awkward moment to come. Others looked sympathetic but unwilling to intervene. A few seemed genuinely curious, wondering what would happen next. In the back, she saw some of the other catering staff watching nervously, worried about their jobs. Diana's fingers hovered over the keys. She hadn't touched a piano in 2 years and 8 months, not since the day she'd walked away from everything. The day her world had fallen apart, and she'd had to make the hardest choice of her life. She could feel the weight of those lost years pressing down on her. All the practicing, all the studying, all the dreams she'd had to abandon, they were right there, just under the surface, threatening to overwhelm her if she let them. Richard stood to the side, his phone out and recording. "Whenever you're ready," he said, and there was no mistaking the anticipation in his voice. He expected her to fumble through, "Mary had a little lamb," or admit she couldn't play at all. Either way, he'd get his moment. Diana took a deep breath. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. Something else was building inside her. Something she'd kept locked away for so long. Anger, frustration, and underneath it all, a fierce, burning need to prove that she was more than what these people assumed. She thought about her mother, sitting in that care facility, her memories slowly fading. She thought about her father, who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for her lessons when she was growing up. She thought about all the sacrifices her family had made so she could pursue her gift, and how she'd had to walk away from it all. These people saw her as nothing, just a waitress, just hired help, someone to serve them drinks and be invisible, someone to mock for their entertainment. They had no idea who she really was. Diana's hand settled on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth under her fingertips, familiar despite the years away. Muscle memory was a powerful thing. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She closed her eyes for just a moment, centering herself. When she opened them again, something had changed in her expression. The fear was gone. The uncertainty had vanished. What remained was pure determination, and then she began to play. The first notes rang out across the penthouse, clear and strong and absolutely perfect. Not the hesitant plinking that Richard had expected. Not the fumbling of an amateur. These were the notes of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Diana's fingers moved across the keys with the precision and confidence of a master. She'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. Most professional pianists spent years perfecting it. The opening chords alone required strength, control, and an intimate understanding of the instrument. She played them flawlessly. The sound that filled the penthouse was extraordinary. Diana's fingers flew across the keys with speed and precision that seemed impossible. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 demanded everything from a pianist. Power, control, emotion, technical mastery. Diana was delivering all of it. The smirk vanished from Richard's face. His phone was still recording, but now his hand had dropped slightly, forgotten. His mouth opened in pure shock. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. Around the room, the reaction was immediate. Conversations didn't just stop. People seemed to stop breathing. The guests who had been smirking moments before now stood frozen, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion to awe. Those who had pulled out their phones to record a humiliating moment were still recording, but for an entirely different reason. Diana's eyes were closed as she played, her body swaying slightly with the music. Her hands moved with the fluid grace that only came from thousands of hours of practice. The difficult passages that would make most pianists stumble were executed perfectly. The soft sections were delicate and nuanced. The powerful chords rang out with clarity that made the crystal glasses vibrate. This wasn't someone who'd taken a few lessons as a child. This wasn't even someone who was good at piano. This was someone who had dedicated their life to this instrument. Someone who had reached a level most musicians only dreamed about. Frank, the catering manager, had tears in his eyes. He'd worked hundreds of these events, seen plenty of entertainment, heard professional musicians perform. But there was something about this moment that hit differently. Maybe it was the unexpectedness. Maybe it was watching someone he'd assumed was just another struggling server reveal herself to be something extraordinary. In the back corner of the room, an elderly woman in an elegant black dress pushed through the crowd. Her face had gone pale. She moved closer to the piano, staring at Diana like she was seeing a ghost. The music continued, building in intensity. Diana had moved into the second movement now, the part that was even more emotionally complex. Her playing wasn't just technically perfect. It was full of feeling, full of story. You could hear pain in it, loss, longing, but also hope and beauty, and a defiant joy that came from doing the thing you loved most, even when everything else had fallen apart. Some of the guests were crying now. Not just tearing up, but actually crying. There was something about the music, combined with the impossible situation, that broke through the usual walls wealthy people built around their emotions. A woman in a diamond necklace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that her makeup was running. A businessman who'd been laughing minutes earlier stood transfixed, his champagne glass forgotten. Richard looked around at his guests, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, shame, real deep shame. He'd meant to humiliate this woman, to turn her into entertainment for his friends. Instead, he'd forced someone of extraordinary talent to reveal herself in a moment that should have been joyful, but was instead colored by cruelty. His joke had backfired in the worst possible way. He caught the eye of one of his oldest friends, a man he'd known since college. The friend wasn't smiling. He was looking at Richard with something close to disgust. Others were doing the same. The mood in the room had shifted completely. Richard had positioned himself as the powerful host, the clever entertainer. Now he just looked small and mean. Diana played on, unaware of the changing dynamics around her. She was lost in the music now, in a place she hadn't let herself go for almost 3 years. Her fingers remembered everything, the countless hours of practice as a child, staying up late when she should have been sleeping, playing until her fingers ached. The competitions where she'd won, and the ones where she'd lost and had to learn from failure. The moment she'd been accepted into one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. The scholarship that had made it possible for a girl from Queens to study alongside the best young musicians in the country. And then the ending of it all. Her father's sudden death, the mountain of medical bills and funeral costs, her mother's diagnosis just months later, the impossible choice between her dreams and her family. It wasn't even really a choice. Of course she'd chosen her mother. Of course she'd walked away from everything she'd worked for. What else could she have done? But the music had never left her. She'd avoided pianos, avoided listening to classical music, avoided everything that reminded her of what she'd lost. It hurt too much. But now, with her hands on these keys, it all came flooding back. The pain and the joy mixed together until she couldn't tell them apart. The elderly woman in black had made it to the front of the crowd now. She was staring at Diana with an expression of shock and recognition. Her lips moved, forming a name, but no sound came out. Diana played the final notes of the piece. The last chord hung in the air, reverberating through the penthouse, and then slowly faded to silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence after that performance felt sacred somehow, like the moment after a prayer in a church. Diana sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes still closed. Tears were running down her cheeks, though she didn't seem to notice. Then the room erupted. The applause was thunderous, overwhelming. But it wasn't the polite applause of before. This was real. People were on their feet shouting bravo, with genuine emotion in their voices. The businessman who'd been mocking her earlier was clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. The woman with the diamond necklace was applauding while still crying, mascara streaking down her face. Diana opened her eyes slowly, seeming to come back to herself. She looked out at the standing ovation, at all these wealthy strangers applauding her, and the expression on her face was one of pure confusion. She'd gotten so lost in the music that she'd forgotten where she was, forgotten the cruelty that had led to this moment. The elderly woman in black pushed through the crowd and walked right up to the piano. She was moving fast for someone her age, driven by urgency. "Diana," she said, her voice shaking. "Diana Chen." Diana looked up at the woman, and her eyes went wide with recognition. "Professor Whitmore?" "Oh my God," the woman said, and now she was crying too. "I thought you were gone. I thought we'd lost you forever. What are you doing here? What happened to you?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something important was happening. Richard stood frozen off to the side, forgotten now, irrelevant to the moment he'd accidentally created. Professor Whitmore reached out and took Diana's hands in hers. "Do you know who this is?" she said, turning to address the crowd. Her voice was strong despite the tears. "Do any of you know who you just heard play?" The guests shook their heads, murmuring amongst themselves. "This is Diana Chen," Professor Whitmore announced, her voice ringing with pride and pain and anger. "She was one of my students at Juilliard, one of the most gifted pianists I've taught in 40 years of teaching." She paused, looking at Diana with such intensity that several people nearby felt uncomfortable witnessing it. She won the Tchaikovsky Young Musicians competition when she was 22 years old. Do you understand what that means? That competition is one of the most prestigious in the world. Musicians twice her age with international careers compete for it. And she won. The crowd gasped. People pulled out their phones, already searching for Diana's name, trying to verify this impossible story. She was being courted by concert halls across Europe, Professor Whitmore continued. She had offers to record with major labels. She was 3 months away from graduating when she just disappeared. The professor's voice broke. "I tried to find you. We all did. What happened?" Diana stood up from the piano bench slowly. Her legs felt shaky. Everyone was staring at her now, waiting for an answer. The truth felt too big, too personal to share with a room full of strangers. Diana looked around at all the faces staring at her, waiting for an explanation. Her hands were still trembling from the performance, from the emotion of touching a piano again after so long. The truth sat heavy in her chest, a weight she'd been carrying alone for almost 3 years. "My father died," she said quietly. The room was so silent that everyone heard her despite her soft voice. "He had a heart attack at work. Sudden. The doctor said he was probably gone before he hit the ground." She paused, swallowing hard. He didn't have life insurance. He always said he'd get it, but he kept putting it off because the premiums were expensive. So when he died, there was nothing. Just bills. Professor Whitmore's hand went to her mouth. Other guests shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the kind of story they usually heard at parties like this. The funeral cost $18,000, Diana continued. Her voice was steady now, like she'd gone somewhere else where the emotions couldn't touch her. I didn't know funerals cost that much. I thought maybe $5,000, something I could handle. But no, $18,000 for a basic service and burial plot. She looked down at her hands. I had about $7,000 in savings from teaching piano lessons and competition prize money. Juilliard gave me a scholarship, but it didn't cover everything. All of that went to the funeral home, and I still owed $11,000. Richard felt like he was shrinking with every word Diana spoke. Around him, his wealthy friends were hearing what real financial crisis sounded like. Not losing money in the stock market. Real crisis, the kind where you couldn't bury your own father with dignity. Then 2 months later, my mother started forgetting things, Diana said. Little things at first. She'd forget where she put her keys, tell me the same story twice. I thought it was grief. But it got worse, fast. She'd forget to turn off the stove. She got lost coming home from the grocery store. One day I came home and found her sitting in the dark, crying because she couldn't remember how to turn on the lights. Professor Whitmore was crying openly now. Several other guests were wiping their eyes. Even the servers standing in the background were listening, many with tears on their faces. They understood this story in a way the wealthy guests never could. The diagnosis was early-onset Alzheimer's, Diana continued. She was only 56. The neurologist said it was aggressive, that she'd decline quickly. He was right. Within 6 months, she couldn't be left alone. She needed full-time care. Diana laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you know how much memory care facilities cost? The cheap ones start at $4,000 a month. The good ones are $8,000 or $10,000. She looked up at Professor Whitmore, and the pain in her eyes was raw. I couldn't do both. I couldn't keep going to school and work enough to pay for her care and Dad's funeral bills. The math didn't work. I tried. I picked up every shift I could, taught lessons until midnight, slept 4 hours a night. But it wasn't enough. I was falling behind in my classes because I was too exhausted to practice. Why didn't you come to us? Professor Whitmore asked, her voice breaking. We could have helped. There are emergency funds, there are programs. I did come to you, Diana said softly. I went to the financial aid office. They told me about a hardship fund that could give me up to $2,000. $2,000. My mother's care was costing me $4,000 a month. The funeral debt was being sent to collections. I was getting calls from debt collectors 20 times a day. She shook her head. $2,000 was generous, and I was grateful, but it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The room felt heavy with the weight of her words. These people threw parties where the champagne alone cost more than Diana's hardship fund. They wore watches worth more than a year of her mother's care. And here was someone who'd had to choose between her dreams and her family because of money they spent without thinking. So I withdrew from Juilliard, Diana said. 3 months before graduation. 3 months before I would have had a degree that could have opened doors, that could have led to teaching positions or performance opportunities. But I needed to work immediately, and I needed jobs that paid cash. Jobs that gave me flexible hours so I could visit my mother. Jobs that didn't require a degree I didn't have yet. She gestured around at her catering uniform. This is what that looks like. I wait tables at a diner during the day. I do catering at night. On weekends, I pick up cleaning jobs, babysitting jobs, anything that pays. I work about 90 hours a week. My mother's in a facility that's not great, but it's safe and they're kind to her. Most days when I visit, she doesn't remember who I am anymore. But sometimes, maybe once a month, she has a clear moment. She'll say my name and she'll ask me if I'm still playing piano. Diana's voice finally broke completely, and I lie to her. I tell her yes. I tell her I'm doing great. 'Cause what else can I say? That I gave it all up? That would break her heart on the rare day she can still have a broken heart. The silence that followed was absolute. Diana wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, suddenly aware that she'd just told her most painful story to a room full of strangers. But something about playing again, about being recognized, had broken open something inside her that she'd kept locked away. Professor Whitmore stepped forward and pulled Diana into a tight hug. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Other guests began moving forward. The woman with the diamond necklace approached, pulling out her phone. "What's the name of your mother's facility?" she asked. Diana looked confused. "Why?" "Just tell me." Diana gave her the name, and the woman started typing rapidly on her phone. She was texting someone, her fingers flying across the screen with urgency. A man in an expensive suit stepped forward. "I'm the director of the New York Philharmonic," he said. "I want you to audition. Next week. We have an opening for a featured soloist position, and after hearing you play, I think you'd be perfect." I can't," Diana stammered. "I work, I have shifts. I need the money." "We'll pay you for the audition," the man said firmly. "And if you get the position, it pays $80,000 a year plus benefits. You could cut back on your other jobs." More people were pulling out phones now, making calls, sending texts. The energy in the room had completely transformed. These wealthy people, who minutes ago had been ready to laugh at her humiliation, were now mobilizing their resources and connections. Professor Whitmore pulled back from the hug but kept her hands on Diana's shoulders. "You're coming back to Juilliard," she said firmly. "I don't care what I have to do. We'll create a special scholarship, we'll find you housing, we'll make it work. You're too talented to lose. We already lost you once. I won't let it happen again." Richard stood against the wall, watching all of this unfold. His cruel joke had transformed into something he never could have anticipated. He'd meant to humiliate someone he saw as beneath him. Instead, he'd revealed someone extraordinary, and triggered an outpouring of support from people who moments ago had been complicit in his mockery. He slipped away to his study, unable to watch anymore. The video on his phone showed everything, his smug face as he'd set up the joke, Diana's fear and resignation as she walked to the piano, and then the transformation, the stunning performance that had changed everything. He thought about posting it, about how many views it would get. But for once in his life, Richard Blackwell felt something stronger than his need for attention. He felt ashamed. 3 weeks later, Diana stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, her hands shaking for entirely different reasons than they had at Richard's penthouse. She wore a borrowed concert gown, deep blue and elegant. Through the curtain, she could hear the murmur of the sold-out crowd. 1,500 people had come to hear her play. The last 3 weeks had been a whirlwind. The woman with the diamond necklace, Catherine Morrison, had called the care facility the next morning. She'd arranged to cover 2 years of Diana's mother's care costs at one of the best memory care centers in the state. Diana had cried on the phone for 10 minutes straight. The Philharmonic director had been true to his word. Diana had auditioned and been offered a position as a featured soloist. The salary was more money than she'd seen in her life. She'd given notice at the diner and the catering company, though Frank had hugged her and told her she'd always have a job if she needed one. Professor Whitmore had worked magic at Juilliard. Diana was re-enrolled with a full scholarship covering tuition, housing, and a living stipend. She'd be graduating in the spring, only 1 semester behind. But tonight was something else entirely. This concert had been Professor Whitmore's idea, a comeback performance, with all proceeds going to a fund for artists facing family hardships, the Diana Chen Foundation. The concert had sold out in 48 hours. By the time everything was tallied, they'd raised over $200,000. Diana peeked through the curtain and saw her mother in the front row. That had been the biggest miracle of all. Her mother was having one of her clear days, rare and precious. She'd known Diana's name that morning. She'd understood what was happening tonight. The staff at the new care facility had helped her get ready, had brought her to the concert hall in a van equipped for patients with special needs. There was a nurse sitting beside her just in case, but so far her mother was alert and present. She also saw Richard Blackwell sitting in the very back row. He'd sent a letter 2 weeks ago with a real apology. Not a casual "sorry if I offended you," but genuine remorse. He'd included a check for $50,000 made out to the Diana Chen Foundation. Diana hadn't known how to feel about that. The money would help people, but it didn't erase what he'd tried to do. Professor Whitmore had told her she didn't have to forgive him. "Some people learn from their mistakes," she'd said. "Let his money do some good, even if he can't." The stage manager touched Diana's shoulder. 2 minutes, he said quietly. Diana took a deep breath. Her hands had stopped shaking. She thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, full of dreams before life had knocked her down. She thought about the woman she'd become, working 90-hour weeks, surviving but not really living. And she thought about who she was now, about to step onto one of the most famous stages in the world. The loss was real. The sacrifice was real, but so was this. So was the comeback. 1 minute, the stage manager said. Diana walked to the edge of the stage, standing in the wings where the audience couldn't see her yet. The lights were bright on the piano, a Steinway Model D even more beautiful than Richard's. The orchestra was seated, instruments ready. The conductor stood at his podium, waiting for her entrance. She thought about all the people who'd helped her get to this moment. Catherine Morrison, the Philharmonic director. Professor Whitmore, who'd never stopped believing in her. Frank and the other servers who'd come to support her. Even Richard, whose cruelty had accidentally led to her redemption. But mostly she thought about her parents. Her father, who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for her piano lessons, who'd driven her to competitions, who'd never gotten to see this moment. But she felt him there anyway. And her mother sitting in the front row who'd sacrificed so much for Diana to have this gift. Even now, with most of her memories gone, some part of her had held on to the music. Places, the stage manager whispered. Diana stepped onto the stage. The applause was immediate and thunderous. 1,500 people on their feet before she'd played a single note. She walked to the piano, the gown flowing behind her, and bowed. The applause continued. She could see Professor Whitmore in the 3rd row, tears already streaming down her face. Catherine Morrison was beside her, clapping enthusiastically. Frank was in the middle section, grinning like a proud father. And in the front row her mother was standing, applauding, fully present and aware. Their eyes met, and Diana saw recognition there. Pride. Love. Her mother mouthed something that looked like, "I love you, sweetie." Diana sat at the piano and adjusted the bench. The audience settled into silence, that breathless anticipation before the music begins. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestra lifted their instruments. This was it. This was what she'd given up 3 years ago. This was what she'd thought was gone forever. And somehow, through circumstances she never could have predicted, through cruelty that had accidentally become catalyst, she'd found her way back. The conductor's baton came down. The orchestra began the opening measures. And then it was Diana's turn. Her hands touched the keys and she began to play. She'd chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 again. The same piece she'd played at Richard's penthouse, but this time it was different. That night she'd played it with anger and pain and the grief of everything she'd lost. Tonight she played it with something else. Hope, gratitude, the bittersweet joy of second chances. The music soared through the concert hall, powerful and perfect. Diana poured everything into it. Every early morning shift. Every night she'd worked until she couldn't stand. Every visit to her mother where she wasn't recognized. Every sacrifice her parents had made. Every hand that had reached out to help her. The audience listened in absolute silence, transfixed. Some were crying. This wasn't just a performance. This was a story told through sound, a journey from loss to redemption. In the front row, Diana's mother swayed gently to the music, a smile on her face. She might not remember this tomorrow. She might not remember it an hour from now. But in this moment, she was here. She was present. She was watching her daughter do the thing she was born to do. Diana played the final notes, her hands lifting from the keys as the last chord faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The silence felt sacred, like everyone was afraid to break the spell. Then the applause erupted. Not polite applause. A standing ovation that shook the walls. People were shouting, crying, throwing flowers onto the stage. The orchestra members were stamping their feet. The conductor was wiping his eyes. Diana stood and bowed, overwhelmed. She gestured to the orchestra, to the conductor, sharing the moment. But the applause continued, focused on her. She looked at her mother, who was still standing, still applauding, still present. Diana blew her a kiss, and her mother caught it, pressing her hand to her heart. That simple gesture, so full of love, broke Diana completely. She cried openly on stage, not bothering to hide the tears. In the back row, Richard Blackwell stood and applauded. He'd meant to humiliate someone, to turn a person into entertainment. Instead, he'd accidentally given someone their life back. It didn't redeem him, but maybe he could learn from it. Diana took her final bow and walked off stage. Professor Whitmore was waiting in the wings, and they embraced, both crying too hard to speak. "You did it," Professor Whitmore finally managed. You came back. Diana nodded, unable to find words. She had come back. Not unchanged, not undamaged, but maybe that was okay. Maybe the cracks were part of the story now. Maybe they'd made her playing richer, deeper, more honest. She'd lost 3 years. She'd lost her father. She was losing her mother slowly. But she'd found something too. She'd found out what she was made of. She'd found out who would stand beside her when everything fell apart. She'd found her way back to the music and back to herself. And that, Diana thought as the applause continued beyond the curtain, was worth everything.